My wife said in front of everyone, "People only invite you because I'm your wife. On your own, you're a nobody." That week, I stopped going anywhere with her. 3 days later, one of her closest friends pulled her aside, and whatever she whispered made my wife turn completely pale beside me. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments what city you're watching us from. 3 days after my wife went completely pale in front of her best friend, I understood everything. I understood why she'd told me what she told me in front of everyone. I understood why I'd responded with only 3 words. And I finally understood why that week I'd stopped going anywhere with her. But to tell you what happened those 3 days, I have to start from the beginning, from that night at Adrian's house, when Marlon opened her mouth in front of everyone and said something I couldn't forget, something that without knowing it was going to change everything. We were at a gathering like so many others, drinks in hand, background music, laughter filling the room. I was sitting next to her, calm, listening to a conversation that barely included me. And then, without anyone expecting it, without a clear reason, Marlon dropped those words with a smile on her face, as if they were something funny, as if they weighed absolutely nothing. "People only invite you because I'm your wife. On your own, you're a nobody." The silence barely lasted a second, but I felt that second in my chest like something breaking slowly, without noise, without warning. I saw the others' faces. Adrian looked at his glass and looked away. No one said anything, and Marlon kept smiling as if she'd just told a joke that everyone understood except me. I took a deep breath, looked her straight in the eyes, and said with the calmest voice I could find in that moment, "Good to know." Nothing more, no yelling, no scene, no drama, just those 3 words. And then I looked forward again, as if the conversation had ended right there, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. But inside something had changed forever, something that didn't have a name yet, but was already taking shape somewhere I couldn't clearly see yet. My name's Joaquin. I'm 43 years old, and until that night, I thought I had a normal marriage, not a perfect one. Of course, no marriage is, but one where respect existed. One where even if there were differences, even if there were difficult moments, things were said in private between the two of us, without an audience, without witnesses. That's what I believed. That's what I thought Marlene and I had after 11 years together. Marlene and I had met when we were both in our early 30s. She was extroverted, charismatic, one of those people who enters a room and everyone turns to look at her without her doing anything special to achieve it. She simply had something, an energy that filled spaces. I was different. I always was calmer, more reserved, the kind who prefers to listen before speaking. At first, that difference complimented us. She took me out of my closed world. I gave calm to hers. It worked. For years it worked well, but over time something started changing. Not suddenly, it's never suddenly. It was little by little, so slowly that you almost don't notice it until you're too deep inside to see from the outside. Marlon started making small comments at first, almost imperceptible. A word here, a phrase there, things you could interpret as a joke in a moment, as something unimportant, as the kind of thing you say without thinking and isn't worth taking seriously, but over time they accumulate, and what accumulates sooner or later weighs you down. I remember months before that night at Adrian's house. We were at a dinner with friends, and someone asked about my job. I managed a small distribution company I'd built for years with a lot of effort. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't in magazines, but it was mine and it worked well. Before I could answer, Marlon did it for me, with a perfect smile. Joaquin has his little business. You know how he is, calm, without big ambitions. And she kept talking about something else. The others laughed with her. I stayed quiet. I smiled and kept that somewhere in my chest where other things were already stored. Another time, I arrived late to a gathering because I had a problem at the company that couldn't wait. When I walked in, Marlon was telling something and everyone was laughing. She greeted me with a look and said out loud, "He's here?" He always shows up when the party has already started because he's late for work, but never for eating. Laughter again. I poured myself a drink, sat down, and kept storing it. It's not that I didn't care. I cared, but I was the type who thought these things were talked about at home, in private, calmly, not in front of others, not with a drink in hand and an audience ready to laugh. So I waited. We'd get home. I tried to bring up the topic, and Marlon always had the same answer. "Oh, Joaquin, it was a joke." Don't be so sensitive. You take everything so seriously. And with that, the topic was closed, and I went back to storing it. That dynamic repeated more times than I should have allowed, and I know it now. At that time, I justified it in 1,000 ways, that she was like that she didn't do it with bad intentions, that deep down she loved me, that all marriages had their issues. I convinced myself I was exaggerating, that I was too sensitive, like she said, that the problem was mine until that night at Adrian's house, until those words, until that 1 second silence that changed everything without anyone in that room knowing it yet. Because when I said, "Good to know," and looked forward as if nothing had happened, I wasn't letting it go. I was deciding in silence, without announcing it, without drama. I was making the most important decision I'd made in years. And that decision was going to reveal something I wasn't completely ready to discover. That same week, I stopped going anywhere with her without explanations, without arguments, without a single word about the subject. I simply stopped and started waiting. Because if Marlon was right, if I really was a nobody without her, if people only included me because of her, then my absence wasn't going to matter to anyone. No one was going to ask about me. No one was going to notice I wasn't there. And I confirm it with my own eyes. But if she was wrong, if everything she'd told me in front of everyone was nothing more than a lie she'd told herself, then something very different was going to happen. And 3 days later it happened. The first days after that night were strange. There were no fights. There were no uncomfortable conversations. There were none of those tense moments you'd expect after something like that. Marlon acted as if nothing had happened, as if her words at Adrian's house were something that had already been digested, processed, and forgotten, as if I'd forgotten it too. And maybe that's what she expected, that I, like so many other times, would store everything in that place in my chest where there was already so much stored and move on, as if the world were round and everything was fine. But this time it was different. This time I wasn't storing it. This time I was observing. The first event came 3 days after the gathering at Adrian's house. A dinner at some acquaintance's house. People Marlon had more of a relationship with than I did, but who I'd always accompanied without thinking too much about it. That Saturday afternoon, while she was getting ready in front of the bedroom mirror, I was sitting on the living room couch with an open book I wasn't reading. She came out perfumed, dressed, ready, and looked at me with that usual expression, the one that took for granted that I'd be ready too. "Aren't you going to change?" "I'm not going," I said, without looking up from the book. It was a pause. I felt it more than I saw it. "What do you mean you're not going?" "We already told them we were both going." "You told them." I didn't say anything. Another silence, longer this time. "Joaquin, what's wrong with you? Are you sick?" "No, I'm fine." "You go have a good time." I heard how she picked up the keys, how she hesitated for a moment by the door, and then I heard how the door closed alone, without me, and I stayed there in the living room with the book in my hands and something in my chest that wasn't exactly sadness. It was more like clarity, like when you've been in a dark room for a long time, and suddenly someone opens a window, and light comes in, and your eyes take a little while to adjust, but there's no way back to the darkness anymore. That night Marlon arrived late. I was already in bed. She didn't ask anything. I didn't say anything either. And so began what I'd internally started calling the experiment. It wasn't revenge. I want that to be clear from the beginning, because it'd be very easy to interpret it that way, and it'd be wrong. I didn't stay home that night to hurt Marlon, nor to punish her for what she'd said. I stayed home because her words had planted a question in my head I couldn't ignore. A simple, direct, uncomfortable question. Was she right? Was it true that, without her, I was a nobody in those social circles? Was it true that people included me only for being her husband and not for any reason that had to do with me? I'd spent 11 years building what I thought were real friendships, real conversations, real connections. I'd helped Adrian when he had problems with his business and needed a $4,000 loan that I gave him without asking for interest or an exact return date. I'd spent 3 weekends in a row helping Raphael remodel part of his house when his budget wasn't enough to hire someone. I'd listened to Jonathan for hours on nights when he didn't know how to move forward with his marriage, on nights when he needed someone who was simply there. I'd done that. Not Marla me, but maybe all that didn't matter. Maybe in the social world where we moved, she carried the weight, and I was simply the man who came with her. The accessory, the compliment, the nobody who filled the seat next to her. I had to know, not out of pride, but because if that was true, I needed to know. And if it was a lie, too. The second week, 2 invitations arrived. One for an informal gathering at Ivana's house that Marlon mentioned at breakfast as if she already took for granted we'd go together. And another that came directly to my phone, a message from Adrian that said, "Joaquin, next Saturday some friends are getting together to watch the game. Are you coming?" Only my name, without mentioning Marlon, without the usual "both of you come." I kept it in silence. I didn't tell Marlon anything about that message. For the gathering at Ivana's house, I did the same thing again. I stayed home. Marlon went alone again, this time with fewer questions, as if she was already processing that something had changed, even if she didn't know exactly what yet. And when she arrived that night, there was something different on her face. It wasn't anger, it was more like discomfort, as if something small had happened at that gathering that she didn't expect and didn't know how to interpret yet. I didn't ask her what had happened. I waited. The next day, with a naturalness that clearly took effort, Marlon told me while we drank coffee. "Ivana asked about you." She said it looking at her cup, without drama, almost in passing. But I knew Marlon well enough to know that phrase wasn't casual, that there was something behind those 4 words she was still processing. "How kind of her," I said, and I continued with my coffee, but inside something moved. Ivana had asked about me, not about both of us, about me. At a gathering where Marlon was present, someone had noticed my absence and had asked specifically about me. It was a small detail, but small details when you're paying attention say enormous things. That same afternoon, I replied to Adrian. I told him yes, that on Saturday, I'd go watch the game. Alone, without mentioning Marlon, without asking if she was invited, because the message had come for me and I was going to go for me. On Saturday, I arrived at Adrian's house with a $40 bottle of whiskey that I knew he'd like. I walked in, said hello, and something happened in that room I didn't expect. People greeted me with a warmth that took me by surprise. Raphael gave me a long hug. Jonathan patted my back hard. Adrian welcomed me at the door with a genuine smile and said out loud, so everyone would hear, "Look who arrived, just the guy we were missing." I sat down, poured myself a glass, and for the next 3 hours I was part of real conversations. Conversations where they asked my opinion, where someone remembered something I'd said weeks ago and brought it back because they found it interesting, where no one treated me like Marlon's husband. They treated me like Joaquin, like someone who had a place in that room in his own right. I got home late that night. Marlon was awake, sitting in the living room with her phone in her hand, and an expression I couldn't fully read at that moment. She looked at me when I walked in. "Where were you?" "At Adrian's house watching the game." A pause, just with the usual friends. She didn't say anything else. Me neither. I went to sleep with something new in my chest. It wasn't euphoria, it wasn't triumph. It was something calmer and deeper than all that. It was the feeling that the answer to my question was starting to appear, and it wasn't the answer Marlon expected me to find. The days that followed were the quietest we'd had in years. Not the uncomfortable silence of a couple who has fought and doesn't know how to talk again. It was another type of silence, denser, more loaded. The type of silence that settles in when 2 people live in the same house, but each is processing something different, something that isn't ready to turn into words yet. Marlon continued with her routine. I continued with mine. On the outside, everything seemed normal. On the inside, I knew nothing was. I kept not accompanying her to events. I didn't announce it. I didn't discuss it. I simply kept choosing to stay, and every time I did, I observed her reaction before leaving. I observed her face when she arrived. I observed the small detail she thought I didn't notice, because she'd always underestimated me in that too, in my ability to observe, to read between the lines, to notice what isn't said. One night, almost 10 days after the gathering at Adrian's house, Marlon arrived from a dinner with her friends, and something about her was different. I wouldn't know how to explain it precisely. It was something in the way she entered the house, slower than normal, with less energy than she usually brought after a night out with her group. She sat in the living room without taking off her coat, which was weird for her, and kept looking out the window for a moment that felt too long to be casual. I was in the kitchen making something to drink. I watched her from there without saying anything. I waited. Finally, she spoke without looking at me yet. Raquel told me something today. Raquel was her best friend, the lifelong kind, the kind who knows all a person's secrets and all their versions. If Raquel had told her something, it wasn't a filler comment, it was something that mattered. What did she tell you? I asked with the usual calm. Marlon took a while to answer. She took off her coat slowly, folded it over the armchair, and when she finally looked at me, there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen in her for a long time. It wasn't exactly guilt, it was something prior to guilt. It was the exact moment before someone understands they messed up, when reality starts to set in, but pride still doesn't know how to step aside. She told me that at the last gathering, when you weren't there, several people asked about you. She said it as if each word cost her a different effort. Several people, I repeated, not to rub anything in her face, but because I genuinely wanted to understand. Yes, Adrian, Jonathan, also a couple I'm just getting to know, the ones who recently joined the group. She paused. They said you were missed. I stayed quiet, not because I didn't know what to say, but because there was something in that moment that deserved silence, something I didn't want to rush or inflate or turn into more than it was, even though inside I felt those words were rearranging something that had been twisted for too long. How kind of them. I finally said the same phrase as always, but this time with a different weight. Marlon looked at me for another second and then went to the bedroom without saying anything else. And I stayed there with my glass in hand, thinking about everything that moment meant, without either of us having said it out loud yet. The next day, I received a message from Jonathan. He wasn't the type to send messages for no reason. He was reserved, direct, a man of few words. The message said, "Hey Joaquin, haven't seen you around here for a while." All good, 3 lines. But those 3 lines came from someone who didn't ask out of politeness. Jonathan was the type who, if he asked, it was because he genuinely wanted to know. I replied yes, that everything was fine, that I'd had things to take care of. And he wrote back almost immediately, "When you can, let's get together. I have something to tell you." That caught my attention. Jonathan wasn't the type to say that without having something real to say. We agreed to grab a coffee that same week. Meanwhile, at home, tension kept building in a way neither of us named, but we both felt perfectly. Marlon had stopped taking for granted that I'd accompany her to events. She no longer told me like someone announcing something decided. Now she'd ask me, or just wouldn't say anything and would go alone. And every time she arrived from somewhere without me, she brought with her that same air of someone processing something she didn't expect to find. One noon, while we were eating together at home, Marlon put her fork down on her plate and looked at me in a direct way she hadn't used with me in a long time. "Are you mad at me for what I said at Adrian's house?" It was the first time she mentioned it directly. Almost 2 weeks had passed. I looked at her. I took a moment before answering. "I'm not mad." "Then why don't you go anywhere with me?" "Because I'm seeing something," I said. "Seeing if you were right." Silence. Marlon frowned slightly, as if the answer had taken her by surprise, although deep down it shouldn't have. "Joaquin, it was a joke. I didn't mean it." "I did take it seriously," I said, without harshness, without aggressiveness, with the same calm I'd had from the beginning. "If it's true that without you I'm a nobody, I need to know. And if it's not true, that too." She didn't answer. She picked up her plate, went to the kitchen, and I stayed at the table with the feeling that that conversation, although short, had been the most honest we'd had in months. The coffee with Jonathan happened that Thursday. We sat in a quiet place, unhurried, with 2 cups of black coffee between us. Jonathan wasn't the type to beat around the bush, so he was direct almost from the start. Marlon made a comment the other night. He said, "At the gathering where you weren't there." I won't repeat it exactly, but I didn't like it, and I wasn't the only one who didn't like it. I looked at him without interrupting. There are people in that group, Joaquin, who have genuine respect for you. Not because of Marlon, because of you, for what you are, for how you are, for what you've done for people without going around telling everyone. Adrian hasn't forgotten about the loan. Raphael hasn't forgotten about the weekends you gave him either. Those things aren't forgotten. I felt something move in my chest. It wasn't exactly pride, it was more like relief. The relief of someone who has carried a heavy doubt for too long and suddenly is told the weight wasn't real. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked him. Jonathan raised his cup. He looked at me over the rim. "Because someone had to tell you, and because I think you already knew it." You just needed to hear it. I left that cafe walking slower than normal. I wasn't in a hurry. I had a lot to think about. The experiment that had started as a silent question was starting to give answers, and the answers were drawing a map that I didn't know where it was going to lead me yet. But I knew, with a certainty I hadn't felt in years, that I could no longer ignore what that map was showing. That night, I got home with Jonathan's conversation still spinning in my head, not as noise, but as something you keep processing in silence, like when a phrase settles somewhere in your mind and keeps working on its own, even if you're doing other things. I made myself something for dinner, sat alone in the kitchen, and spent a long time looking nowhere, thinking about everything that had happened in those 2 weeks since the night at Adrian's house. I thought about the years I'd spent in that group of people, the conversations I'd had, the things I'd done for each of them without expecting anything in return, not because I was a saint, but because that's how I was. Because when someone I considered a friend needed something I could give, I gave it without calculating it, without measuring it, without keeping a record of what I was owed. That was something Marlene had never fully understood about me. She was more strategic in her relationships, more aware of who was convenient for her and who wasn't, more attentive to the balance of what is given and what is received. I didn't work like that, and for years that had been a source of small frictions between us. Comments of hers that I let pass, because it wasn't worth turning them into something bigger. But now I was sitting in that kitchen thinking that maybe that difference between us was more important than I'd wanted to admit, because Marlon had truly come to believe that the social value of our couple was her, that I was the weight she carried, the opaque compliment to someone bright. And she'd said it out loud in front of everyone with a smile, as if it were a truth everyone shared, and only I was too naive to see. I went to sleep late that night. Marlon was already in bed. I lay down in silence on the edge of the mattress, looking at the ceiling in the dark, and thought about something Jonathan had said before we said goodbye at the cafe. Something I let pass at the time, but that now came back stronger. He told me almost in passing, almost as a minor detail. The last time Marlon was at a gathering without you, the vibe was different. I don't know how to explain it. It was different. He hadn't explained in what way, and I hadn't asked. But now, in the darkness of that room, that phrase occupied my mind in a way I couldn't ignore. The following week brought something I didn't expect, 2 things actually that arrived almost at the same time, and that together started to complete a picture I was putting together without having all the pieces yet. The first was a message from Adrian, not a casual message, a long message of the kind Adrian almost never sent, because he wasn't a man of many written words. The message said, among other things, that he wanted to talk to me, that there was something he felt I should know, that it wasn't his place to say it perhaps, but that if he were me, he'd want someone to tell him. He asked if we could meet soon. I replied yes. We agreed to meet over the weekend. The second thing was something that happened at home on a Tuesday afternoon and that I couldn't ignore even if I tried. Marlon was in the living room, talking on the phone. I walked in from the hallway without making noise, not because I wanted to listen, but because I hadn't heard her talking and I didn't want to interrupt her. I stopped when I heard her tone of voice. It was a tone I knew, the tone she used when something truly worried her, and she was talking to someone she trusted. I only managed to hear a fragment before she saw me and lowered her voice. What I managed to hear was enough. I don't understand what's wrong with him, Raquel. He's acting weird. He doesn't go anywhere with me, and when he goes to things alone, he arrives differently. I don't know how to explain it. He arrives like more himself. I backed down the hallway without her seeing me. I stood there for a moment processing that last phrase. He arrives like more himself. Marlon had said it without realizing what she was revealing, without understanding that that phrase was in itself a confession. Because if I arrived more like myself when I was in spaces where she didn't control the narrative, that meant only one thing, that in the spaces where she did control it, I'd been shrinking. Little by little, without fully noticing it, I'd been making myself smaller to fit in the place she'd assigned me. And most importantly, what that phrase was telling me without Marlon knowing was that people noticed, that there was a version of me that existed outside her shadow, and that that version was recognizable. It was real. It was the one Jonathan had described, the one Adrian wanted to tell me something about, the one Ivana had missed at that gathering. The weekend, I arrived at Adrian's house mid-morning. He welcomed me alone. His wife wasn't there. He offered me coffee, and we sat on the terrace with the sun coming in from the side and a comfortable silence between us, the kind that only exists between people who have truly known each other for years. Adrian took a while to get into the subject. He stirred his coffee several times, looked toward the garden, and then looked at me with a serious expression that came from inside. "What I'm going to tell you isn't easy," he said. "And if at any point you feel I'm meddling where I shouldn't, tell me, and we stop." "Speak," I told him. He breathed. "Marlon has said things about you. Not just that night, at other gatherings too. Things that minimize what you do, what you are. Sometimes with humor, sometimes without it. And there are people in the group who have noticed, people who don't say anything because they don't want conflict but who notice." I looked at him without interrupting. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I let it be there without reacting yet. "What she told you that night in front of everyone," Adrian continued, "wasn't the first time she said something like that. It was just the first time she said it so openly, so shamelessly, to be honest." I took a sip of coffee slowly. "And why are you telling me now?" I asked. "Because these weeks you've been coming alone, Joaquin, people have asked about you. Not out of politeness, with genuine curiosity, with real appreciation. Raphael the other day said you were one of the most principled people he knew, and he said it without anyone asking him. He said it out of nowhere in the middle of a conversation about something else." I kept quiet for a moment. "And does Marlon know you're telling me this?" Adrian shook his head. "No, and it's not my intention to tell her either. This is between you and me. But I felt it was my obligation, after everything you've done for me, to tell you the truth. You helped me when no one else would have. For $1,000, no strings attached. Joaquin, that's not forgotten. And it doesn't seem fair to me that you keep believing, even for a second, that you don't have a place in this group that is completely yours." I stayed looking at the garden for a long moment, the trees, the sky, the sound of some bird in the distance, and I felt something I hadn't felt with that clarity in a long time. I felt I was seen, not as someone's husband, not as anyone's compliment, as Joaquin, as the 43-year-old man who had built his life with his own hands, who had given without asking, who had been present when it mattered, and who had made the mistake of believing for too long that making himself small was the same as being humble. They weren't the same. They never had been. I returned home that afternoon with something new installed in my chest. It wasn't rage. It wasn't pain. It was more like a resolution, the kind of resolution that comes when you already have enough information to know that things can't stay exactly as they are, that something has to change, that the time for keeping quiet and hoping everything rearranges itself had already passed, that what came next was going to require something more from me, something harder, more honest, and more necessary than everything I'd done up to that point. Marlon was home when I arrived. She looked at me from the couch with that expression I'd already learned to read these weeks, the expression of someone who's waiting for something without knowing exactly what. I returned her gaze, and for the first time in a long time, I felt I didn't need to look away. I didn't sleep well that night. It wasn't because of anguish or rage or any of those emotions that churn your stomach and won't let you rest. It was because of clarity, because sometimes clarity also keeps you awake. When you've been living inside a distorted version of reality for a long time, and suddenly that version is corrected, your brain needs time to process the new map, to recalibrate. To understand that what you thought was the path wasn't the path, and that the real terrain is different from what you'd imagined. I stared at the ceiling for hours. Marlon was sleeping next to me with that ease that had always caught my attention, that ability of hers to close her eyes and disconnect from the world as if nothing weighed too much. I'd never been able to do that. I was the type who took things to the pillow and kept thinking about them until finding somewhere to place them. And that night, there were too many things looking for their place at the same time. I thought about what Adrian had told me, what Jonathan had told me before, the phrase I'd accidentally heard when Marlon was talking to Raquel on the phone. He arrives like more himself. I kept coming back to that phrase. I kept finding something in it that hurt in a specific way, not like a blow, but like a slow pressure, like something that's been squeezing for a long time and that you hadn't named until now. Because if I arrived more like myself when I was outside the spaces Marlon controlled, that meant that inside those spaces I'd been being less less authentic, less present, less me. And the question that wouldn't let me sleep that night wasn't whether that was true, because I already knew it was. The question was, since when? Since when had I started shrinking without noticing? Since when had I accepted, without anyone explicitly asking me, taking up less space than belonged to me? I tried to trace the moment. I searched my memory for some starting point. Sure, some night or some conversation where I could say, here it started, but I couldn't find it because that's not how these things work. There isn't an exact moment. There's an accumulation, a series of small decisions, chosen silences, comments let slide, yielded spaces that seemed insignificant at the time, and that together, seen from this side, form a pattern I couldn't ignore. I got up before dawn, made coffee, sat in the dark kitchen with a cup in my hands, and stayed there a good while, just thinking, not with anguish, with a sort of cold serenity that was new to me, as if something that had been moving inside me for weeks had finally found a place to stop. When Marlon got up and entered the kitchen, I was still there. She looked at me surprised. What time did you get up? Early, I said. She poured herself coffee, sat across from me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. It was one of those silences that have their own texture, that aren't empty, but full of things that haven't been said yet. She was the one who spoke first. Joaquin, I think we need to talk. She said it looking at her cup with a voice that wasn't her usual one, lower, more careful. Tell me, I replied. She raised her eyes to me. I've been thinking a lot these weeks about what's happened, about how things have been between us. She paused, and I think what I said that night at Adrian's house wasn't right. She said it. She finally said it, and I waited because I knew there was more, that Marlon hadn't reached that point just to say that there was something else behind those words still looking for a way out. I shouldn't have said it in front of everyone, she continued. It was a mistake. I nodded slowly. Was it only a mistake to say it in front of everyone? I asked. Or was it also a mistake to think it? Silence. Marlon looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. There was something there that was more complicated than a simple answer. I didn't mean to say you're worthless, Joaquin. What did you mean then? Another longer pause. I think sometimes I feel I'm the one who keeps our social relationships alive, the one who organizes, the one who proposes, the one who calls. And maybe that made me believe that without me things wouldn't work the same, that without me you wouldn't have the same place in the group. She said it with an honesty that took effort, that was visible. But these weeks I realized I was wrong. I stayed looking at her. What made you realize? She took a while to answer, moved slightly in her chair, and then said something I didn't expect. Raquel told me something. The night I got home acting weird, remember? Of course I remembered. She pulled me aside at the gathering. She whispered something in my ear that I didn't want to hear at the time, but I couldn't get out of my head. She took a long pause. She told me people in the group talked about you with a respect that had nothing to do with me, that when you weren't there they asked about you, not about us, about you, and that there were people in that circle who cared about you and valued you in a way I'd never seen because I'd never paid attention. She said it. She finally said it. And I understood why she'd arrived pale that night. Because Raquel, her best friend, the person whose opinion mattered most to her in that group, had told her quietly what no one else had dared tell her out loud, that she was wrong. That reality was the exact opposite of what she believed and proclaimed in front of everyone with a smile. It took me a moment to process all that. Not because it was a surprise, I already knew. I've been proving it week by week with my own eyes, but hearing it from her mouth, hearing that she knew it too and was saying it out loud, that was different, that had a different weight. And how did you feel when Raquel told you that? I asked her. Marlon lowered her eyes to her cup again. I felt ashamed, she said in a very low voice, and scared. Scared of what? She raised her eyes to me, of what that meant about me, of what it said about how I'd been treating you, that there were people who'd noticed it before me. There was a long silence between us. Outside light was starting to come through the window. The day was beginning, and in that kitchen, between 2 cups of coffee and years of unsaid things, something was changing shape. I still didn't know exactly what shape it was going to take when it finished changing. But I knew that moment, that conversation was a turning point, one of those moments you remember later as the before and after of something important. Marlon, I finally said calmly, that you said that to me in front of everyone wasn't just a momentary mistake. It was the result of something that's been growing for a long time. Comments, situations, things I let pass because I thought it wasn't worth turning them into a conflict, but together they painted a picture I don't like. She looked at me without interrupting. I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because if we're going to talk seriously, we need to talk about everything. Not just that night, everything. She nodded slowly with a seriousness I hadn't seen in her for a while. Without the easy smile, without the usual shield. Just her in front of me listening. Can you do that? I asked her. I could try, she said. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that answer was honest. Not perfect, not enough yet, but honest. And honesty, even if it arrives late, is always worth more than the comfortable silence that replaces it when one doesn't have the courage to look for it. Honest conversations have something particular about them. They don't end when you get up from the table. They continue. They stay floating in the air of the house. They slip through the walls. They appear in the midday silences and in the sideways glances while you do ordinary things like washing a plate or closing a window. The conversation that morning in the kitchen didn't end with the coffee. It continued for days, not always in words, sometimes just in the way Marlon looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching her, in the way I chose my words more carefully than before, in the new tension between us, different from the previous weeks. Less cold and more loaded with things still looking for their final shape. I continued with my routine. I kept going to places where I was invited alone, without announcing it and without turning it into a statement. I simply kept being me in the spaces where I could fully do so, and that alone was already changing things I hadn't fully calculated when I started the experiment. One Thursday afternoon, I got a call for Raphael. Raphael didn't call much. He was more about short messages and in-person meetings. When he called, it was because he had something to say that didn't fit in a message. I answered on the second ring. Joaquin, do you have a moment? Sure, tell me. I heard him take a breath before speaking. Raphael was like that, deliberate, the kind who thinks before opening his mouth, which I always appreciated because it meant that when he spoke, what he said had real weight. Look, I don't know if it's my place to tell you this, and if you feel I'm meddling where I shouldn't, just tell me and that's it. But there's something I've been thinking for days whether to tell you or not. And in the end, I decided yes, because if it were the other way around, I'd want someone to tell me. Speak no problem, I told him. Last week I was with Marlon and a group at some acquaintance's house. You weren't there. And at some point during the night, I don't remember exactly how we got on the topic. Someone mentioned your name. I don't remember exactly in what context, and Marlon made a comment. He paused, a comment of the type we've heard before, diminishing. You know how they are. I knew. Of course I knew. What happened after the comment? I asked. That no one laughed. Raphael said, that's what happened. Silence. And then someone changed the subject, but it was an awkward silence, Joaquin, the kind that says more than any word. And I saw Marlon's face. In that moment, I saw she noticed that she expected the usual reaction, and it didn't come. I stayed quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me this, Raphael? Because I think you have the right to know how others see you and how they see her when she does that. Another pause. And because the 3 weekends you spent helping me with my house remodel, Joaquin, working without charging me a single dollar when I didn't have money to pay anyone, I haven't forgotten that. A man who does that isn't a nobody. He's the exact opposite. I had to take a moment before answering. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because there was something in hearing that from Raphael's mouth, who was a man of few words and even fewer gestures, that reached a place in me I didn't expect. Thank you, Raphael, I finally said. Don't thank me. Just take care. We hung up. I stood with the phone in my hand for a long minute, looking out the window without seeing anything in particular. I was thinking about Marlon's face that Raphael had described. The face of someone who expects a reaction and doesn't receive it. The face of someone who suddenly finds themselves without the echo they took for granted. Because that's what had been happening at those gatherings without me seeing it directly. Marlon had built for years a dynamic where her comments about me generated a response, a laugh, an accomplished gesture, something that confirmed the group shared her vision. And now, for some reason, I was beginning to understand more clearly. That confirmation had stopped coming. That night, Marlon got home earlier than usual. She had something on her face I already knew but in recent days it had acquired a different intensity. It was the expression of someone carrying something they don't know how to drop, who has been thinking so much about one thing they no longer know if what they think is clear or if it's just the result of the exhaustion of overthinking. She sat in the living room. I was reading. I watched her over the book for a moment and then put the book down on the table. "Are you okay?" I asked her. She looked at me, and what I saw on her face in that moment was something I hadn't seen in a long time, maybe never with that intensity. It was vulnerability, not the calculated vulnerability she sometimes used when she wanted to generate empathy. It was the other kind, the real one, the one that appears when someone no longer has the energy to keep their shield in place. "Not entirely," she said. "What happened?" She took a while, moved her hands in her lap, as if looking for something to lean on. "This afternoon, I was with Raquel. We drank coffee for 2 hours, and she told me things that she stopped. She breathed. She told me things I didn't want to hear but needed to hear. I waited without interrupting her. She told me she'd been wanting to talk to me for a while about how I behaved with you, that she hadn't done it before because she didn't know how, because she knew I'd get defensive. She took a long pause, and she was right. Every time someone has told me something about this, I've gotten defensive. I look for a way to justify it or change the subject. And today you didn't. Today I couldn't. Today Raquel was very direct. She told me what I did that night at Adrian's house was cruel. She used that word cruel, and that it wasn't the first time she'd seen something like that from me, though it had never been so explicit. Marlon lowered her eyes. When she raised them back to me, there was something wet in them she was making an effort to contain. She asked me if I'd realized what I was doing, if I was aware of it, and I didn't know what to answer, Joaquin, because the truth is I don't know. I don't know if I did it without thinking, or if somewhere inside me I did it on purpose, and not knowing that scares me more than anything else. The silence that followed was one of the long ones, the kind that have weight and texture, and that you don't want to break too soon because what's inside them hasn't finished saying itself yet. Finally, I spoke. "You know, what was the hardest part of all this for me, Marlon?" She looked at me. "It wasn't what you said." "Well, it was what you said, but it wasn't just that. What was hardest was realizing you'd been thinking it for a while, that that night wasn't a slip. It was something already formed there that found a way out." I paused, and that made me wonder how long I'd been living next to someone who saw me like that, without me fully knowing it. Marlon didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was lower than before. "I didn't always see you like that. There was a time when I saw you in a completely different way. What changed?" Another long pause. This was one of the longest of the whole conversation. I think I got used to being the visible one, the one who talks, the one who organizes, the one who fills the spaces. And at some point I stopped seeing what you did, because what you did made no noise, didn't announce itself, didn't draw attention. And what doesn't draw attention over time you stop seeing, even if it's there all the time. She said it without added defenses, without justifications, just that. And it was the most honest thing I'd heard her say in years about this topic, maybe about any topic. "What makes no noise also matters," I said. "Sometimes it's what matters most." She nodded slowly with her eyes still a bit wet. And for the first time since that night at Adrian's house, I didn't feel distance between us. I felt something more complicated than that, something that wasn't reconciliation yet, because reconciliation requires more than one conversation, however honest it may be. But it was the first real movement toward something different, toward the territory where things could be said and heard without either of us having to shrink so the other could fit. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. Not because everything was resolved, it was far from it, but because something had moved in the right direction. And sometimes that's enough for the body to rest, for the mind to find a place to lean on, even if just for a few hours, to remember that difficult things, when faced head-on and with honesty, have a way of becoming, if not simpler, at least more manageable, more real, more ours. And what's ours, even if it hurts, is always better than what's faked. The days that followed that conversation were different, not radically different, not in the way you'd want things to change suddenly and forever after an important moment, but different in a subtler, more everyday way, more similar to how things really change when the change is genuine and not just a promise made in an emotional moment. Marlon was quieter, not with the defensive silence from before, but with a different one. The silence of someone who is truly thinking, who is reviewing internal things that haven't been reviewed in a while, who is looking inward with an honesty that takes effort, and for that very reason is worth more than any words said too fast. I watch her not with distrust, with attention, because I'd learned in these weeks that observing without judging was one of the hardest and most necessary things you could do inside a relationship. And because I knew what was happening between us was still fragile, that it could break with too much pressure or too much rush, that it needed space to develop at its own pace, even if that pace was slower than I would have wanted. One Saturday morning, Marlon proposed something I didn't expect. "Do you want us to go together to the gathering tonight at Ivana's house?" She said it in a different way than she'd always said it before, without taking for granted that I'd go, without announcing it as something decided. She asked me like a real invitation, with a genuine possibility that I could say no. I looked at her for a moment before answering. "Why do you want me to go?" She took her time. "Because I want people to see you, and I want to see myself in that context. I want to see how I behave when you're there. I think I need to." It was an honest answer. The kind that isn't prepared, the kind that comes directly from some true place. I nodded. "Okay, I'll go." We arrived together at Ivana's house that night, and something happened from the moment we walked in that neither of us commented on at the time, but we both felt. The way they welcomed us wasn't the usual way. It wasn't the warm reception directed mainly at Marlon, with me following closely. This time the greetings came for both of us, for each of us. Adrian shook my hand firmly and told me he'd missed me. Ivana hugged me and told me the house wasn't the same without me, with a naturalness that had nothing exaggerated about it. Jonathan patted my back and asked how things were going at the company with a genuine interest that made me remember why I considered him a real friend. Marlon saw it all. I saw it on her face, not with envy, which is what I maybe would have expected at another time. She saw it with something more like understanding, as if every greeting, every gesture, every moment of genuine connection I had with those people was confirming in real time what Raquel had told her, what she herself had started to understand. But seeing it live had a different weight than hearing it or imagining it. At some point during the night, I was in a conversation with Raphael and a man who'd recently joined the group, someone I was just getting to know. And the conversation was one of those that flow on their own, where no one has to try hard to keep it alive because the interest is real and the comfort too. At some point, that man asked me about my company. I told him he asked intelligent questions, he was truly interested, and in the end, he told me something that stuck with me. People who build things in silence have always seemed more interesting to me than those who announce them before building them. He didn't say it thinking about anything else but the conversation, but I heard it thinking about everything that had happened in the last few weeks. What Marlon had said, the silent experiment, everything I discovered without looking for it in a dramatic way, but simply by stopping being where I wasn't valued to be where I was. Later, at a moment when I stepped away to get a drink, Marlon appeared beside me, stood next to me with a glass in her hand, and looked towards the group for a moment without saying anything. Then she spoke quietly, just for me. "You're right," she said. I looked at her. "In what?" "In everything. And that this is yours too. And that these people care about you, not because of me, you." She paused. It took me too long to see it. I didn't answer right away. I took a sip of my drink. I looked towards the group too. "You know what's strangest about all this, Marlon?" I finally said. "What?" "That I never needed to be told. I never needed anyone to confirm I had value. What hurt me wasn't the doubt about myself. It was realizing the person who sleeps next to me saw me that way. That was what broke something inside me that night at Adrian's house." Marlon looked at me, and this time she didn't look away. She kept her eyes locked on mine with a firmness that was also new in her, or maybe not new, maybe forgotten. "I know," she said, "and I'm sorry," not as a phrase. "I'm truly sorry." I nodded slowly, without saying anything else right then, because there were things not yet ready to be said that needed more time and more conversations and more nights like that to find their right shape. But that moment, those quietly spoken words, while the rest of the group laughed and chatted a few feet away from us, that moment was real. And what's real when it appears after so much time of things that weren't entirely so, has a flavor you recognize even if you haven't tasted it in a long time. We went home together that night in the car. During the ride, neither of us spoke much, but the silence was different from the previous weeks, less tense, less loaded with unsaid things, more like the silence of two people sharing a space and not needing to fill it with word for the space to be worth something. When we got home and walked in, Marlon stopped in the living room and looked at me. "Joaquin, do you think we can fix this?" It was the most direct question she'd asked me in all that time, and she asked it in a way that didn't hide the fear behind it. The fear that the answer was no. The fear that the damage was too much and too deep to be repaired. The fear that appears when you finally understand what you risked without realizing you were risking it. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "I don't know yet," I said with total honesty, without cruelty, but without false promises either. "What I do know is that to fix it I need what happened these weeks not to be just an episode. I need it to be the beginning of something different, of a different way of seeing each other, of talking to each other, of being with each other. And if it is," she asked, "if it really is the beginning, then we work on it," I said. "Both of us, without either of us having to shrink for the other to fit." Marlon nodded slowly, her eyes still carrying that vulnerability that had appeared in recent days and that I hoped wouldn't disappear too soon, because that vulnerability was the closest thing to the real version and the real version of people. Even if it's more fragile and harder to sustain than the constructive version, is always the one worth knowing. That night, before we fell asleep, Marlon said one last thing in the dark bedroom, very quietly, almost as if she wasn't sure if she wanted me to hear her. I'm afraid of being the type of person who does that without realizing it. I'll let it float in the air a moment before answering. The fact that it scares you already says something important about who you are. Silence. What does it say? That you still care, and people who care have the chance to change. The ones who don't, simply keep going. She didn't say anything else, and neither did I. And in that final silence, which was different from all the silences we'd had in weeks, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time inside that marriage. Not certainty, not complete relief, but possibility. The real, fragile, honest possibility that things could be different, not perfect, never perfect, but different, truer, worthier of both of us. And sometimes possibility is enough to keep going, not forever, but for the next day. And the next day is where everything that really matters begins. The weeks that followed were the most complicated and at the same time the most necessary we'd lived in years. Not because there were big fights or dramatic moments, but because what we were both doing was something we'd never fully tried in 11 years of marriage. We were being honest, not with the comfortable honesty you use when things are going well and telling the truth costs nothing, but with the other kind, the kind that scrapes, the kind that forces you to look in a mirror with no filters and see things that you'd rather not see, but need to face if you want something real to grow on the other side. We'd started truly talking with a regularity we didn't have before. Not forced conversations or scheduled sessions where we both arrived with a list of complaints, but real moments, sometimes in the kitchen in the morning, sometimes late at night when the rest of the world was asleep, where things came out on their own because the space for them to come out finally existed. I'd speak. Marlon listened. Marlon would speak. I listened. Without interrupting, without defending oneself before the other finished, without turning every little thing said into an argument to be won. It wasn't easy. Neither of us pretended it was. One night, late, Marlon asked me something she'd been wanting to ask me for a while. I noticed it in how she introduced it with that caution of someone who knows the question can open something with no easy closure. Was there a specific moment when you felt you started making yourself smaller? That you remember? It took me time to answer. I searched my memory with honesty, without dramatizing, but without minimizing either. Yes, I finally said, there was a night about 4 years ago. We were at a dinner with people from your work. Someone asked me what I did. I started explaining about the company, and you interrupted me mid-answer to change the subject to something you thought was more interesting for the conversation. Marlon frowned slightly, trying to remember. I don't remember, she said. I know. That was also part of what hurt. that for you it was so natural it didn't even stay in your memory. Silence. And what did you do in that moment? She asked. I smiled. I kept eating and stored away. Marlon closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was something in them that was half pain and half recognition. How many times did you store it away? Too many, I said without anger, just with the truth. That conversation lasted until past midnight. We brought out things that had been stored for years in places where they get heavy without one naming them. And there were moments when it was uncomfortable, when Marlon wanted to defend herself and had to make a visible effort not to, when I had to remind myself the goal wasn't to win, but to understand that we weren't in a trial. We were in a conversation we both needed to have to know if there was something between us worth saving with all the work that required. At the end of that night, Marlon said something that stuck with me with a precision few phrases have. I think I started seeing you as an accessory to me instead of seeing you as a separate whole person. And that's something I wouldn't do to a stranger. And yet, I did it to you, the person I chose to spend my life with. She said it with a voice so low, I almost didn't hear her, but I heard her and I stayed silent because there was no answer that did justice to that. Just the silence and the weight of what she just said floating between us in the darkness of the room. In the following days, something changed in how Marlon moved in the social spaces we shared. Not suddenly, not perfectly, but it changed. I started noticing it in small details that would have gone unnoticed by me before because I wasn't paying that kind of attention. When someone asked me something at a gathering, Marlon waited. She didn't step in. She didn't redirect. She let me answer. She let me exist in the conversation at my own volume, without adjusting it to hers. And there were times when I saw her from across the room, watching me with an expression I couldn't fully describe. It wasn't exactly pride, it was more like rediscovery, like when you find something you thought was lost and realize it was always there, only you'd stopped seeing it. One afternoon, Ivana invited us both to grab a drink at a quiet place near home. It was the first time we'd gone out like that, in a small, intimate setting since this whole thing started. We sat the three of us at a table by the window with the afternoon sun coming in sideways, and the conversation flowed in a way that surprised me by how natural it was. At some point, Ivana looked at me with a calm smile and said, "Joaquin, you know we've always loved you here, right? Not as anyone's husband, as you." She said it with a simplicity that made it impossible not to believe her. And I believed it, not because I needed to be told, but because those words, coming from someone like Ivana, who wasn't one to sugarcoat reality, had the weight of something true. I looked at Marlon. In that moment, she was also looking at Ivana, and then she looked at me, and what I saw on her face was something I hadn't seen in a long time, something I recognized even if I hadn't seen it so clearly for years. It was admiration, not the admiration that's performed socially. The other kind, the one that appears when you see someone you know well and suddenly see them as others see them and understand something you'd lost sight of. Back home that night, Marlon sat on the edge of the bed and watched me as I got ready for sleep. "Ivana's right," she said. "About what?" I asked, although I knew the answer. That it was always you, not an extension of me. You. She paused. "I wonder how long you've been you with everyone else, but me." It was a question that hurt, not because it was an attack, but because it was completely honest and because the answer was complicated and we both knew it. I think I stopped being completely me with you when I understood, without anyone telling me, that there was a version of me you found more comfortable, more manageable, easier to have beside you without taking up too much space. I said it slowly, choosing every word, and I started fitting into that version because I wanted things to work. Because I thought that's what marriages that work did. Yield, adapt, make no noise. But that's not what marriages that truly work do, Marlon said. I didn't confirm. The ones that truly work are the ones that let each person occupy the space they deserve without taking space away from the other. Marlon nodded slowly with that new seriousness that had appeared in her over the last few weeks, and that I hoped would stay, that it wouldn't just be the result of the scare of almost losing something, but the beginning of a different way of being. "Can you forgive me?" she asked in a very low voice. I sat next to her on the edge of the bed. I looked straight ahead for a moment before answering. "I'm working on it," I said honestly, without promises I couldn't keep. Forgiveness isn't a switch you turn on. It's a process, and I'm in it. Is that enough for now? She asked. Yes, I said, for now it's enough. We sat like that for a moment, both on the edge of the bed, looking straight ahead in the silence of the room. And in that silence, there was something new between us. It wasn't the easy harmony of the early years or the built-up tension of the last ones. It was something more honest than both, something that can only exist when two people have gone through something difficult together and have chosen, despite everything, to keep looking in the same direction. It wasn't a guarantee that everything would be fine. It wasn't the neat, happy ending you'd want these stories to have. It was something more real than that. It was two people with their wounds and their mistakes and their unfinished business, choosing to try, choosing not to run from the hard stuff, but to step into it with open eyes and the willingness to see what was inside, even if it wasn't comfortable. And that, even if it's not enough forever, sometimes is enough for the moment you're in, for the coming day, for the next step, which is ultimately the only way anything important moves forward one step at a time with honesty, with real willingness and the courage to stay when it'd be easier to leave. Several months have passed since that night at Adrian's house, since that phrase that cut through the living room air like something sharp and that I received in silence, with a 3-word answer and a decision made inside, without anyone knowing it yet. Several months since I started the nameless experiment, since I stopped accompanying her to places to see what happened when I wasn't there, since I discovered little by little, with the patience of someone who observes without rushing, that reality was completely different from what Marlon had proclaimed in front of everyone with a smile on her face. Several months have passed, and things aren't the same, not in the easy and neat way you'd want things to change when you've gone through something like this, but in the real way, the way that includes good days and days where the weight of everything that happened feels heavy again, even if you thought you'd already processed it, in the way that has ups and downs and moments of doubt, and conversations that start well and end in an awkward silence that we both have to learn to get through without escaping sideways. Marlon and I are still together. That's the simple truth, but the marriage we have today isn't the same one we had before that night. And that's not simple either, because there are things that change for the better, things that opened up and aired out and now breathe in a way they couldn't before. And there are other things still in process, still looking for their final shape, that sometimes hurt in unexpected ways, in moments you don't anticipate, and that require patience and willingness and the resolve not to give up when it'd be easier to do so. What I can say for sure is this. I'm different. Not in a dramatic way or the kind you announce, but in the quiet way someone changes after going through something that forced them to look at themselves honestly and decide from that honest place, who do they want to be from now on. I stopped shrinking. That's the first and most important thing. I stopped taking up less space than I deserved. I stopped storing things in that place in my chest where they pile up until they weigh too much. I learned, or rather remembered, because I always knew it somewhere I'd stopped listening to, that silence isn't always humility, that sometimes silence is just fear disguised as peace, and that real peace isn't built by keeping quiet about what matters, but by saying it when it matters calmly, respectfully, but saying it to Marlon. The conversations now are different, not perfect, never perfect, but different. There's an honesty between us that didn't exist before or existed only in diluted versions. Versions that looked like honesty, but were actually the result of two people who had learned to avoid certain truths to maintain a calm surface. Now the truths are said, sometimes they're hard. Sometimes the conversation gets difficult, and one of us has to make a real effort not to shut down, not to return to the old patterns that are comfortable even if they're harmful, but the effort is made by both of us, and that matters. Marlon did something I didn't expect, something that when she told me took me by surprise in a way I took a while to fully process. She told me she'd started talking to a therapist alone, not couples therapy alone, that she wanted to understand where certain things in her came from, certain patterns, a certain need to be the most visible, the most necessary, the most central in any space she inhabited. That she wanted to understand if that had deeper roots than simply her personality or her way of being, and what she could do about it. When she told me, I didn't answer right away. I stayed quiet for a moment and then told her I thought it was brave because it was. Not everyone has the willingness to look inward without the guarantee that what they'll find there will be easy to see. And Marlon was doing it with all the defenses that characterized her still present, but with something new too, with an openness she didn't have before, maybe always had, but never had enough reason to show. The friends in the group noticed it too. It didn't say it explicitly, it wasn't that kind of group, but it was noticeable in the dynamic, in the way gatherings unfolded when Marlon and I arrived together. There was something more balanced, more genuine. Marlon listened more, spoke up more carefully, and, instead of resenting it, as I might have feared she would, she seemed to find something in it more satisfying than her easy, starring role from before. As if discovering that real connection with people tastes completely different from simply being the center of their attention. Adrian told me one day bluntly, as he was, "I don't know what happened between you two. You don't tell me, and I don't ask. But something changed, and what changed was for the better." I thanked him with a nod without going into details, because there are things that belong to you and the person you live them with and don't need to be explained or shared to be real. Raphael, for his part, called me one Saturday morning with a proposal I didn't expect. I was thinking about expanding the business, he told me. There was an opportunity he wanted to explore, and he wanted to talk to me because he valued my opinion on these things. We spent that morning talking about numbers, possibilities, risks, and what was worth trying, even if there were no guarantees. It was one of those conversations you remember, because in it you feel completely present, completely yourself, without filters or adjustments or reduced versions. When I hung up, I stayed thinking about that, about the difference between being seen and being invisible, between taking up space and pretending you don't need it, between belonging to something and simply appearing in the margins of what belongs to another. I'd been in the margins for too long, not because anyone had forced me to be there, but because I myself had accepted that place without questioning it, because I'd convinced myself it was easier, more peaceful, even smarter not to make waves, not to claim the space that belonged to me. To let things be as they were, without intervening too much, but I've been paying the price for that in silence, in that accumulation of stored things that over time turn into a weight you carry, without fully knowing why you feel so tired. One afternoon, while driving back home after a meeting at the company, I thought about something I never thought about with such clarity. I thought about what it had cost me to realize all this, about the path I'd had to travel, about the humiliation of that night at Adrian's house, which at the time had broken something inside me, and which now, seen from this side, I understood as the moment when something that had been about to break for a while finally broke, and that sometimes things need to break so you can see what was behind them, what was hidden under the calm surface of a life that seemed to work, but at cracks neither of us had wanted to fully see. I don't wish for anyone to go through something like this. I don't wish for anyone to hear from the mouth of someone they love that they are a nobody, that their place in the world depends on another, that without that person they be invisible. Those words hurt in a way that doesn't always have a name and doesn't disappear quickly, even if you want it to disappear. But if I had to find something in all this worth carrying, something that made up for the weight of what was hard, it'd be this. I found myself not in a mystical way or the kind that sounds good in quotes to share, but in the concrete and everyday way you find yourself when you stop seeing yourself through someone else's eyes and start seeing yourself with your own. When you stop measuring your value by what someone else assigns you and trust again what you know about yourself from the inside. I'm Joaquin. I'm 43 years old. I built a company with my own hands for over a decade. I helped my friends when they needed it without keeping track of what I was owed. I was present when it mattered, in the ways that make no noise but that people don't forget. And for too long I allowed someone to convince me, without me fully authorizing it, but without me stopping it either, that all that wasn't enough, that I wasn't enough. That's not going to happen again. Not because I say it as an empty declaration, but because I understand it now in a way I didn't understand before. That respect starts with oneself, that you can't ask anyone to see you if you yourself have stopped seeing yourself, that making yourself small isn't generosity. It's a way of disappearing that over time damages not only the one who disappears, but everyone around them, because no real relationship can be built on a reduced version of someone. What I'd say to anyone going through something similar, who feels someone beside them has been convincing them they take up less space than they think, who has started doubting their own value because of how someone who should love them treats them. It's this. Don't wait to be told you have value. Don't look for it in the eyes of the one who denied it to you. Look for it where it's always been, in what you do when no one is looking, in the people who ask about you when you're not there, in the way those who truly know you treat you. Value isn't granted. It isn't earned with anyone's approval. It's there. It always was there. Sometimes it just needs you to stop covering it up so others can see it, and so you yourself can see it too. That night at Adrian's house, when Marlon said what she said, and I answered with 3 words in silence, I didn't know yet everything I was going to discover. I didn't know the experiment that was about to begin was going to show me things I needed to see. I didn't know the group of people I thought I knew was going to surprise me with an affection that had always been there, even if I hadn't known how to fully see it. I didn't know Marlon, with all the damage she'd done without completely understanding what she was doing, had the capacity to look at herself honestly when finally given enough reason to do so. I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew something had broken, and sometimes things that break let light in through the cracks, and that light, although it hurts at first when your eyes aren't used to it, is the best thing that can happen to someone who'd been in the dark for too long without knowing they were. Good to know, I'd said that night. And it was very good to know. Everything, every part of everything that came after, because what you know, even if it hurts, belongs to you. And what belongs to you, no one can take away.